Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for getting up early to be here. I'm going to present with Colette. This paper is also co-authored with Camille, who's back in the corner there. I am Rich. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto, Executive Director of the International Centre for Tax and Development, and Chair of the Local Government Revenue Initiative. And Colette is a Senior Research Associate at U of T and Research Lead for the Local Government Revenue Initiative. The paper we're presenting today is called Building Comprehensive Property Tax Systems in Lower-Income Countries, Cadaster-First versus Property Tax-First approaches. And I'll just cut right to it. Our central sort of challenge that we're engaging with relates to the construction of comprehensive maps of properties. We know that those comprehensive maps of properties are the foundation for any effective property tax system. If you don't identify properties, you can't tax them, and if you can tax them, you have low revenue, but also gross inequities in the system. Yet, despite those comprehensive property tax registers being foundational to effective property taxation, we know that across lower-income countries, almost everywhere, those registers of properties for property tax purposes are hugely incomplete. Often less than half of properties are covered. That includes a lot of sort of relatively more informal properties, but often also includes significant numbers of larger and more valuable properties as well. And so our central question is, why is it that we see these huge gaps in the coverage of property tax registers, given that it should be simple? Properties are removable and visible. And in turn, how might we think about alternative approaches? To answer that question, we don't have a sort of specific research intervention, but instead are drawing on about 10 years of experience, engaging closely with a wide range of governments across Africa, a bit in Southeast Asia, conducting diagnostic exercises of property tax challenges, but also working with governments in designing reform. We're trying to synthesize lessons from those engagements. Our sense is that this is quite representative of the broad experience of low-income countries, because it reflects engagements across a wide range of them. Our starting point is to think about how countries tend to register properties for tax purposes right now. And we titled these Cadaster-First approaches. The idea being simply, first, a property should be legally registered and ideally titled, after which it becomes eligible for property taxation. This is highly intuitive. It follows the intuition that if the tax is to be levied on owners, that first you should register the owner and then you will tax. It also reflects the broader importance of effective land administration and land titling for development. But while that approach is highly intuitive, we know empirically that across, again, virtually every low-income country in the world, that process is extraordinarily difficult to implement in practice because cadasters are hugely incomplete. And if cadasters are hugely incomplete and you operate a cadaster-first approach to property taxation, that means your property register is also hugely incomplete. And if you have an incomplete register of properties, again, low revenues and high levels of inequity. And our sense is that the ineffectiveness of cadaster-first approaches reflects a wide range of challenges related to building legal cadasters, but also to linking legal cadasters to the property tax system. When we think about cadaster building, it's relatively administratively complex, slow, and costly. Detailed property mapping, and particularly identifying owners of properties and getting them titled, is a time-intensive and administratively intensive task. That's in part because identifying ownership can be both politically and otherwise contentious. Land claims are often contested, and where you have contested or uncertain land claims, weak documentation, establishing title can be a long-term process. It's also the case that these cadaster-first approaches tend to disempower local governments. Local governments are often responsible for raising property tax revenues, and they certainly rely on property tax revenues. Yet in cadaster-first processes, they don't have control over their tax base because the tax base is dependent on often national land agencies, posing challenges for revenue mobilization and incentives to improve systems. It also creates disincentives for taxpayers. If registration means I must pay tax, my incentives to register my properties decline, counter to broader development objectives. And finally, a cadaster-first approach we see tends to open spaces for politicization and corruption. In a system where some properties are taxed and others are not, it's easy to find your way into the shadows through collusion to avoid being eligible for taxation. So the bottom line is cadaster-first approaches are highly intuitive, but pose major challenges of effective administration in practice. And so the question we then need to pose is, well, what might one do about it and improve outcomes? And I think there are two kinds of paths that countries have pursued. The first is trying to strengthen cadaster-first approaches in two ways. First, by simplifying those processes through greater reliance on fit-for-purpose approaches to land administration. So simplify the process of titling, and in turn invest heavily in those processes and in building capacity for their implementation across countries. So this is improving on existing processes. The question we then need to ask is that enough? Does that work effectively? Our experience in the countries we've looked at, as we'll talk about, is that even with simplified processes and new investment, it still tends to be too expensive and too slow to quickly arrive at comprehensive registers for property tax purposes. So what's the alternative? The alternative, in our view, has been to look for what we could call second best or good enough approaches to registering properties for tax purposes specifically, in order to achieve comprehensiveness comparatively quickly. And central to that is this question of ownership, and asking the question, if registering ownership is a key driver of the challenges of Cadaster-First approaches, is it possible to bypass that step in order to simplify the property tax process? With that question in mind, what we see increasingly emerging in a number of countries is reliance instead on what we refer to in our paper as property tax first approaches. Approaches to registering properties for tax purposes that bypass the need to identify ownership in order to reduce costs and accelerate towards comprehensiveness. Pragmatically, what this tends to involve is using aerial imagery to rapidly map, address, and measure properties, rolling out relatively low-cost ground truthing exercises to ensure the accuracy of that information, like building characteristics, and register ownership information and occupancy information when it's available. And then critically, at the point of billing the property rather than the owner. The idea being, if you don't know who the owner is, you can still tax the owner by delivering a bill to their property, addressed to the owner, and if they don't comply with registering penalties on the property itself. Most tax types, you need to know the owner to tax the owner. Property, in some ways, is the exception, where you can deliver tax demands to the owner and levy penalties, even if you don't know their legally registered identity. The end result, as Colette will talk about, is the possibility of rapidly accelerating the registration of properties for tax purpose, and then increasing revenue and equity. We might ask, because this is quite an intuitive way of approaching this problem, why more countries don't do it already, and why it's been so difficult for countries to transition towards more simplified approaches, given long-standing evidence that these Cadaster-First approaches weren't delivering effective outcomes for property taxation. And we suggest 4 kinds of challenges. The first is colonial legal inheritances. Most countries inherited laws from the colonial period that dictated adherence to Cadaster-First style approaches. And those laws have been difficult to change. They've been difficult to change in part, I think, because of the growth of epistemic communities committed to existing ways of doing things. Right? If you rely on Cadaster-First approaches, they have a clear intuitive logic, then there's a certain group of people committed to that approach, and for reasonable reasons. I think there are also deeper vested interests here. If you're involved in land administration, land titling, if you're from the Ministry of Lands, if you are a valuer, potentially, you are not only invested intellectually in these processes, but you're also invested professionally. You have a financial interest and institutional interest in their continuation. Change can pose a risk. And finally, there are legitimate concerns about whether the adoption of property tax first approaches could undermine the drive towards more effective land administration and land titling. So I just want to say a word about that last one. So I think that risk is a real one. You don't want to create parallel and duplicative processes of land registration. But I think what we argue in the paper is that there's a scenario in which these two processes don't compete with each other, but instead that property tax first approaches reinforce the drive towards improved land administration and land titling. That's partially through incentives. If all properties are taxed, there's no disincentive for people to become registered in legal terms. It's partially about finances. If you're raising revenue from effective land management and registration through the property tax, that can help to fund the activities required to keep those registers up to date. And finally, it's about high quality information. Those responsible for property taxation have incentives to collect property information, but also to regularly update it over time. And they're often closer to that process than national land authorities. And so leveraging the data coming from property tax authorities to feed into land titling and administration can be an effective strategy to accelerate stronger land titling as well. So let me now pass to Colette, who will talk about some country experiences to support those broad propositions.
But yes, so in this second part of the presentation, I'll present 3 cases that illustrate different approaches that governments have used to registration of properties. And we'll use the case of Freetown in Sierra Leone, Senegal, as well as Togo. So in Freetown, before the reform, the property tax registry was really, let's say, not comprehensive. And at that time, so the mayor in 2018 was campaigning, and one of her objectives was really to improve property taxation to be able to raise more revenues and be able to fund more services. And as this really was part of her campaign, she partnered with different stakeholders, including our research center, the International Center for Tax and Development, the International Growth Center, IGC, as well as donors. And in these discussions, it was really obvious that what is needed is really to have a simplified approach to registration as first step for reform. And for this, the kind of reform that was adopted was really to try and use technology, including GIS mapping, to then be able to register properties. So let me go back to show that before the reform also, properties were registered manually, so enumerators would just go on the field, identify properties, and also it was difficult then to be able to distribute bills because they didn't have physical addresses. So using GIS systems, each property was automatically assigned a GIS-based address using Google Plus codes. And once mapping was completed, a team of enumerators were sent on the field to take a photo of the property, as well as any additional information that is needed for property valuation. And following that, they were able to build, let's say, a more comprehensive property tax register. Now, what we learned from this, I need my notes. So as a result, we can say that the process was somehow cost-effective, really time-effective as well, in the sense that the city could easily register over 100,000 properties in less than 6 months. And this is really, let's say, a 50% increase when compared to what the registry previously had. And then at the same time, revenues were able to also increase by 50%. About the revenues sort of tripled, moving from $500,000 to $1.5 million US dollars. And also, what is important to note is that when this process was happening, properties were able to be registered because the legal environment really enabled the city to register properties without getting the legal registration of the owner or even identifying the legal owner. So when bills were distributed at that time, people were also not objecting the fact that they were receiving bills from the city simply because I guess they were really seeing this as a sign of ownership, and they were even going to the city to try and even update information about properties and their bills. So now, what can we learn from this reform? The first is that the whole program was really successful because it was widely cited as a successful property tax reform in many lower income countries. And it was also replicated in a second city in Kenya. And there is also planning to roll out this approach nationally. And more importantly, we can see that the Freetown case serves as a proof of concept for the property tax approach that we're really for. Now, moving to the case of Senegal, we see that this case illustrates whether attempts to implement a Cadaster-First approach, which in some ways haven't been successful. So to start, we understand that the property tax system in Freetown was underperforming in the sense that, I guess that's the last point here, the performance was about 0.1 to 0.3% of GDP, but more generally, revenues was really, from taxes were really way below what governments can raise from other revenue sources. Now, we understand also that registration in Senegal requires the legal registration of the owner. It requires the unique property number as well as the unique ID, unique number of the taxpayer. And to be able to add those properties to the database, the tax authority will ask taxpayers to declare their assets. However, this was not really respected, or compliance was low. And at the same time, the tax authority could also go into some occasional censuses to try and update the database. But again, they were not really doing it for several reasons, including the lack of motivation. So we understand that really there was a generalized performance of property taxation. Now, what happened is that the Senegal government was really willing to try and improve property taxation, but for several reasons. And for that, 3 programs were implemented from 2019 to 2023, supported by the Senegalese government, but also various donors. And in implementing that program, the Revenue Authority in Senegal really maintained the Cadaster-First approach, which is doing censuses, but also by trying to gather enough legal information about property, the legal ownership information, to then be able to build that register. So we understand that the goal here is really to build a legal cadaster, and from that legal cadaster, be able to build a fiscal cadaster. However, of course, we can see that in terms of improvement, the tax authority had about 50,000 properties nationwide before the reform, but at the end of 2023, that has increased to 160,000 properties. And we can see that it's a 3-fold increase in the registry. But at the same time, if you compare to the case of Freetown, we understand that probably the pace is slow, in the sense that Freetown was able to register more than 100,000 properties in less than 6 months. Now, we were also trying to understand what kind of challenges the tax authorities were facing by using that approach. So the first one is that taxpayers or citizens were really reluctant to provide enough information about the properties, or even provide ID information, simply because they were not trusting the government to use that information for probably reasons that they don't want. Some of the citizens are not also used to pay taxes, so they may not want to also give that information to be able to be added to the tax net. And also, reluctance was due to several political reasons that I can explain during the Q&A. A second issue here was also restriction of census activities during working hours. Because census requires taking a photo ID of the owner, it means that you need to meet that owner, he needs to give you the photo ID. However, when you do those activities during working hours, for people who work during the day, it would be difficult to meet them. But also because these censuses took a long time, there was a generalized fatigue by taxpayers and citizens in general, not really wanting to cooperate because they couldn't see where all this was going. So at the end, we see that in a state like in a country like Senegal, where you see that the government is motivated to improve taxation, there is a lot of investment done in these reforms. Using the traditional approach, the Cadaster-First approach, really doesn't allow them to reach one of the goals, which is to try and build at least a property cadaster and allow local governments to raise more revenue. Simply because they really want to rather update that legal cadaster. And also in discussions that we had with public officials in the tax authority in Senegal, there were some considerations to rather probably move towards registering properties without requiring the legal registration of the owner. Now, we go to Senegal, where the government, the tax authority in Senegal, has rather adopted a hybrid approach also to property taxation. And in this case, we see that the goal was to build both a fiscal cadaster, but also a legal cadaster. Now, in 2022, the Senegalese Revenue Authority launched a new cadaster building process. And that process drew a distinction between 2 different linked but also separate exercises. Building a legal cadaster based on formal land titling. You really need all the information about land titling and legal ownership to be able to build that. But also a fiscal cadaster that just requires registering properties without necessarily having ownership information. So it is important to note that the legal environment in Togo doesn't really instruct the tax authority to, or impose the tax authority to collect legal information to be able to tax properties. So given that flexibility, the tax authority was really open to go ahead by building a fiscal cadaster, and we see that that parallel process of building a legal cadaster. Now, we understand that this hybrid approach, really done by one of the tax authorities, has been very demanding. When we compare it to the Freetown case, which was less administratively demanding because it was only registration of properties, and if ownership information is available, why not? But also less complex than, of course, the case of Senegal. And although ownership information was not required, but the tax authority still went ahead to try as much as possible to gather more legal ownership information about taxpayers, to try and get ID numbers and everything, which really made this also more complex than it should, especially when the legal environment doesn't really impose that kind of requirement. So as a result, the tax authority was able to gather information about properties in one city, the capital, Leone, in 2022, and expanded that process in 2 municipalities in 2023. And we understand that because the exercise has been really time-consuming, more costly, and also dependent on donors, it's likely to even take longer if it was expanded in the whole country. I'll go quickly on that. So now we understand, yes, that there is a complex process here that is likely to lead to incomplete coverage, outdated data and risk of inequity, widespread appeals in case, let's say, there is contestation of ownership, also low voluntary compliance if other things are not done to really be able to push owners to comply with these requirements. But the advantage also, which is something that we don't see in some countries, or at least in many countries, is that there doesn't appear to be the duplication or discrepancy between the different databases, the land cadastre, the legal cadastre database and the fiscal cadastre database, simply because the process is institutionally and procedurally, let's say, interconnected, which is really great. But at the same time, our program, the Lobby program, is partnering with the tax authority to be able to test also the simplified property tax first approach to see exactly maybe what could be, what could come out of that and see if maybe this can be rather adopted for property taxation. Concluding, so we understand that there is really a shift towards more property tax first approaches, which is reflected in many countries that we have been involved in our Lobby program. We also see that in other countries, we can take Uganda for instance, or even Ghana, there is also practices on the ground where tax authorities can illegal and register properties without necessarily changing anything about in the law that will also push them to make that a legal requirement of just registering properties, right? So now we understand that this shift is really guided by pragmatic adjustments by authorities on the ground. Revenues are needed, we need to do something about it. But also there are some conscious efforts between the different actors, experts to share successes about these simplified methods, which are really proving to be effective and good for local governments. Also, there is also a broad emphasis in the land field about all the strategies that are really best suited to lower income countries, as opposed to what we explain that the epistemic communities and others have tried to come up with these complex approaches. And lastly, we understand that it's really important when you implement a reform to rather adopt a strategy that is really tailored to the needs, constraints, and also the context in general of the country you are implementing that reform. Sorry for going over that.
No problem.
Yeah. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Excellent presentation. So what I suggest we do, we take up to 3 questions and then we move to the following presentation, because the worst thing would be to have 4 presentations and then, people have forgotten these excellent presentations. So please identify yourself and yeah.
Peter Loopstam, TU Delft, Netherlands. Same question as I think Tuesday. What about the urbanization, more people living in tall buildings, apartments, condominiums? How do you do that with the remote sensing data, the GIS approach?
I'll come with another question as well, and maybe we can attend those. Very interesting presentation, and it is a very important dilemma also for implementation and policy. We didn't, from my understanding, hear enough about how do citizens' constituents see the property tax first approach. This session is about using property taxation as the basis for a social contract, and how, as a citizen, there is a government initiative for property tax first, but I do not have any property rights, or even in some cases, land tenure security. Why would I participate in this process? What is my incentive? And what is the enforcement modality used by the local government authority in order for this process to actually take place? You mentioned that there are challenges with Cadaster-First approaches, the contestations around the legal boundaries. But I can also imagine that there is contestation that what are you giving me? And then we have another presentation on the budget side and actually the supply. But if we are to go back to the origins of social contract and John Locke, like private property is one of the constituent elements. Ruud.
May I add something to your question? Ruud Katman, also from the Netherlands, but another organization. And I was wondering, why did you choose to send the bill to the owner of the property? Because then you have the direct link with legal questions, etc. Why not make the user of the property the taxpayer? Because when you do that and you register the user, it has less implications for the legal elements, and perhaps people will cooperate even easier with you. So why did you choose to take the owner and not the user of the property?
And finally, to end this, related to that, great point, Ruud. In some countries, what we see is that the property tax first approach could be used in order to eventually end up with a good property registry, right? You start creating a narrative that if you pay your property taxes for 10 or 15 years, you're actually establishing claim to that property, be it land or other. So have you seen that in any of the cases that you presented?
I think you should go, you probably have.
Okay, let me go, and we'll be quick so we don't cut into the other presentations. I mean, they're all really good questions, a bit like what I said last time. They're all the right questions. To the first one now, I can answer it because we have more time. So I think apartments are tricky because one of the underlying ideas here is to make it as simple as possible, and one of those aspects is not having to go inside a property. For a freestanding physical property, you can measure it easily without going inside it. Apartments, it's trickier. I think what we had done in Freetown, what the government's done, was basically to estimate the percentage of each floor of the building occupied by a given apartment. But it does mean, as with all of this, it's a rough estimation. But if you've got a floor that is 1,000 square meters and there's 5 apartments and they're all basically similar, you assign each of them 20%. You can imagine versions of the system where you invite taxpayers to come forward, and if they can provide you a title deed that shows the actual size and it's a bit smaller, that you update the information. But our approach has been give a simplified estimate first and then put the onus on taxpayers if they want to update.
I had a discussion after the meeting Tuesday with another colleague, Jaap Zevenbergen, and he said, okay, in Sweden, they sent the bill to the building. And the association of users has to take care of it.
That's an interesting idea too, actually.
Not sure if it would work elsewhere as well.
We've sort of thought about it vaguely, but we haven't done it. And I've actually wondered if it's a legitimate thing to do. So it's a good example that it's at least legitimate as an option. It's a really interesting thought, actually. That's very helpful. But it is something we're still working on. In a place like Freetown, there aren't a lot of apartment buildings. I was in Addis last week. We were having the same discussion, but Addis is full of big apartment buildings. So you then have to grapple with that question a bit more centrally. And so it's very thoughtful. Let me jump to the next one. Let me jump to the last one because I'll do the easy ones first. Is paying property tax in a system like this then a claim to land tenure and title? The way we've thought about this is it certainly could be, but in some ways it's a decision to be made by the government. We know with certainty that in many countries people do pay because it's a way of establishing tenure. So there's no question about that. Perfect. Now the government though has to decide, do we in fact want to make it a matter of policy that paying property tax for X number of years establishes tenure? On the plus side, it's a very convenient way of establishing tenure, and in most cases, it's probably quite a sensible way of doing it. On the downside, you could imagine some scenarios where wealthy people who can more easily pay the property tax find it a strategy for trying to claim tenure over contested land, right? So you've got 3 claimants to the same parcel of land. The person with the most money always pays the tax, and that's not actually a fair route towards getting tenure. I actually don't know what the right answer is. I think it is a hard debate with no perfect answer.
On this point, even if you have a property tax first approach, then would you not have that elite capture risk that you just described?
So in Freetown, to take the example, the mayor was worried about this. She was worried about people using their financial wealth to claim tenure. So they actually wrote on the tax bills, paying this tax does not establish a claim to land ownership, to legal title. So she wanted that to be explicit so as to avoid any lack of
capture. Yeah.
I'm actually now debating, did she write it in the bill or did they just say it publicly? But they wanted to be explicit, this does not establish land title. Other countries might do exactly the opposite. It's also a way of getting people to comply. If people think this establishes title, you're likely to get much higher levels of compliance. But you run into this risk, again, about equity. Yeah, I don't know the right answer. It's a good question, though. I mean, it's a great question and a really important one that we haven't fully sorted through yet. I guess is the best answer. What was next? Why send the bill to the owner instead of the occupant? Also a very good question. I think the short answer is everywhere we've worked, the law says the tax is borne by the owner. And so it's about legal compliance, basically. And then you ask yourself, well, is it easier to address it to the owner without knowing who the owner is, but with all the complexity that entails? Or is it better to go and try to change the legislation to be on the occupant? Our bet has been it's probably easier just to address it to the owner, even if you don't know the owner, than to try to change the law. Because changing the formal law and what it says about who bears the tax is a highly contested, politically sensitive kind of issue in our experience. And so, but you're right, in some ways, this kind of process potentially does put the burden on the occupant. Because you can imagine you deliver the bill and the owner says, okay, occupant, go pay. Much like in Canada. You know, if someone's renting your property, potentially you just tell whoever's living there, you said, you're the renter, you're responsible for paying the property tax. So incidence is sort of murky in practice. The approach here really reflects aligning to the law in order to reduce potential points of resistance to moving the process forward. But again, it's a very good question without a single right answer to the question, I think. Last one was the social
participation, social contract, yeah.
Yeah, so the social contract questions. So certainly we're very interested in the idea that you want property tax to be a foundation for the social contract. So I think the first question we might ask, again, a good question, is does going and taxing a property that doesn't have title make it less likely you get the emergence of a social contract than if you only tax properties that do have title? Like, I think that's the key trade-off. Is this better or worse than the alternative for building the social contract? My instinct, this is a personal view, is that the property tax first approach means you get universality. Everyone is covered. Everyone's brought into the system. And the fact you don't have title doesn't prevent you making demands on government for accountability. I think you're better off with a universal system and coverage for encouraging public engagement than having a system in which some people are paying and some are not. I think it's probably true that having people registered, this comes to your last point, that having people registered with title and a universal system is the best possible outcome. And so I think you're right. This is in some ways transitional. Like most second best systems, you do this today in hopes that eventually you have a comprehensive cadaster, and that's the basis for taxation. Now, that might be a long transition period, but I do think that's the objective, certainly. I think we all share that view that that's the objective. But yeah, and I think in Sierra Leone, this was very well received, because I think people appreciated the fact that the system was now fair, comprehensive, and equitable, more than they were concerned about the fact that you were taxing properties that didn't necessarily have legal title. But again, there's balancing out. That was our experience, I think, on the ground, and seems to be getting replicated in other places we're working now. But you could get different answers in different places also. Okay, I better stop, otherwise we're going to chew up everyone's time.
We'll get to another round of questions once everyone has been completed, but I think we're going to come back to this issue of, which at essence is also a normative issue. Yeah. When is it good to tax property and under what conditions, right? But the universality aspect is important. Let's now move to Kevin, PhD candidate at the Political Science Department at UCLA, strengthening the fiscal contract by linking the property tax reform and participatory budgeting in Freetown.
Okay, I'm just going to set my timer. So it's good that Will went first because we laid a bit of the groundwork here. So you guys are now familiar with Freetown. You're now familiar with the first step for building fiscal capacity, which is to kind of get properties taxed. And so my presentation is going to focus on the kind of second element for building fiscal capacity, which is now that you're taxing properties, how do you get people to pay? Okay, and this is joint work with a couple of people, but one of them is Will here, who's right in the room. So the motivation for the project is quite simple and is similar to probably some of the presentations you've seen earlier. So there's a lot of variation between fiscal capacity, the extent to which countries tax across the world, but we see like a clear positive relationship between the wealth of a country and the extent to which it taxes, where rich countries tax more and poor countries tax less. And this is important because the literature posits kind of a causal relationship between these factors. Government revenues can drive growth because governments can make growth-enhancing investments in human capital or public infrastructure, etc. So the question then for countries in the lower left, like Sierra Leone, is how do we collect more taxes? We point out Sierra Leone here because this is going to be the focus of the project I'll present. And so we know that enforcement measures work. There's a lot of evidence that if you punish people that don't pay, people will pay more taxes. This is not always a helpful advice for poor countries with weak states. I was in Sierra Leone for a lot of COVID, and this is what the market looked like during the distance and masking mandates. You see a government policy with very little compliance. By definition, low capacity states struggle to enforce their policies. And so they're kind of unable to enforce policies they put in place. Also, we can add that they might be unwilling to for political reasons. And so by enforcing taxation, they might invite citizens to make increasingly more demands, and it also might lead to electoral backlash. So what we're really focusing on this project is what are realistic strategies that weak states can take to increase tax compliance. And for some motivation, we turn to kind of core elements of democratic theory and also kind of canonical arguments about the development of fiscal capacity in Europe. And so these arguments link voice, citizens' participation in public affairs, to state legitimacy, and then so on to tax compliance. So kind of the logic is kind of summed up in the demand made by Bostonians during the Boston Tea Party: no taxation without representation. That is, we're not going to pay taxes unless we get a say in government. Okay? And so in practice, what is increasing voice, what does increasing public participation look like? Well, one typical strategy is a participatory budgeting program. Participatory budgeting programs can look like different things in different parts of the world. And the key elements are citizens are going to deliberate about aspects of government budget, and then they're going to make ideally binding decisions about what to do with that budget. Participatory budgeting is kind of brought into the global light, popularized in Brazil, but it's since spread all across the globe. And so we're going to, in this study, evaluate a participatory budgeting program in Freetown amidst the property tax reform that Colette and Will just described. So as the municipal government is adding tens of thousands of properties to the taxable properties, they're also thinking about ways to increase tax compliance. And so our team partnered to try and implement and then evaluate this participatory budgeting program. So what did it look like in practice? So just to get to the research questions, we're going to ask, did that program increase citizens' perceptions of government legitimacy, and did it increase tax compliance? So what did the program look like in practice? Well, in our project, participatory budgeting takes place in what we call a digital town hall. Okay, so a digital town hall is simply a WhatsApp, I hope you're all familiar with WhatsApp, a WhatsApp group chat, where people from a neighborhood, property owners from a neighborhood, are invited to participate in this group chat. They first deliberate amongst themselves about the key development challenges they're facing in the neighborhood and what type of services they'd like to see implemented. They share those challenges and preferences with their political representatives. So that's the ward councillor, that's the mayor. And then the councillor and the mayor respond to those demands and preferences with videos posted in this WhatsApp chat group. Okay? And then eventually they post a menu of services that the participants in the WhatsApp chat group, the digital town hall, vote over. And so people in the chat group vote over what type of service they'd like to see. The budget for each neighborhood is about $1,500. And so here's the mayor posting a video in the chat group. She's talking about engaging citizens. She's then going to lay out a menu of services that they can select from. That's things like building water pumps. That's things like fixing water pipes, putting in solar streetlights. Afterwards, we followed up and we implemented all of these services. So the government hired a contractor. The water pump was the most popular project. Citizens saw that the project they selected in these digital town halls were delivered. So how did we evaluate this type of program? When we enrolled 3,618 people in this program, or rather we conducted a baseline survey with those 3,600. We then matched participants, or we matched survey respondents based on their baseline characteristics, and then we used a matched pair randomization, placing one of those people in the matched pair into treatment and the other into control. And so, because this is an experiment, our estimation is pretty straightforward. So I'm going to show you results from our pre-registered specification. Okay, so as I said, the first question we're interested in is, did this intervention, did the participatory town hall and the subsequent service delivery increase perceptions of government legitimacy? And so legitimacy is admittedly a bit of an amorphous concept. We kind of conceptualize this in line with Margaret Levy's work that links legitimacy to kind of government trustworthiness, the extent to which citizens believe that the government will follow through on its commitments. And we outlined 4 bins of outcomes: citizens' perceived influence over policy, their perceptions of service delivery and government responsiveness, approval of political representatives, and how the government institution, so in this case the municipal government, is operating. Okay. We measure those outcomes at midline, as such directly after the digital town hall is implemented, and then again after the services are delivered, we call endline. And what we see is really positive, really consistent positive results across these sets of indicators. So we see at midline and endline, the treated participants are more likely to say they have more policy influence, that the government is delivering better services in response to their demands, that they like they approve of the performance of their elected representatives more, but also government is functioning better than it was previously. One thing to kind of point out here is at midline, so this corruption indicator is scaled such that higher level means a better outcome. So moving up on the corruption score is lower corruption. At midline, before services are delivered, people are people are suspect of their government. They've learned that the government has this $1,500 to $100 budget, but they haven't seen anything yet. And so they negative update about corruption. Once the service is implemented, they then positively update and say, oh wow, the government is cleaner than I thought it was. Okay. So in general, we see this kind of clear, consistent effects on our legitimacy outcomes. Okay, so the theory we're working with predicts that the interventions led to these improved perceptions of government legitimacy. Well, is it going to lead to increased compliance? And so we can observe compliance at the individual level through administrative records. And so our control group in 2022 has a tax compliance rate of just under 30%. The treatment does nothing to affect it. So if anything, the point estimate, the average treatment effect on the intervention is actually moving in the opposite of the predicted direction. And so we see on average, no indication, no evidence that this participatory budgeting program impacts tax compliance behavior. So we were really kind of stumped by this null effect. Wow, we saw all these effects on legitimacy, all these attitudinal movements. Why don't we see anything on behavior? So we want to rule out a couple obvious things. Well, maybe it was that the intervention moved legitimacy outcomes up, but it affected other potentially mechanism outcomes in negative ways. We rule out that the intervention has any impact on perceptions of enforcement, perceptions of fairness, or perceptions of neighbors' compliance. Okay, so it's not that it's moving other mediating outcomes. What about spillovers? In experiments, sometimes there's concern that the control group is also experiencing the treatment. Well, our design attempts to guard against this. We use a restricted sampling procedure such that all the study units were at least 15 meters apart. So there was never neighboring properties enrolled in the program. We also leveraged all of the out of sample, all of the out of sample properties. If we look at the effect of the intervention on properties that weren't involved in the study, and we see some kind of suggestive evidence that maybe the treatment spills over to properties not enrolled in the study. But if anything, this effect is going to be extremely small. So it's going to be less than 1 percentage point. So it's unlikely that spillovers are the reason that we see this null average treatment. So our explanation is actually that the treatment produces countervailing heterogeneous treatment effects on 2 particular groups. So based on people's partisan affiliation and baseline policy preferences, their baseline attitudes towards tax, the tax moves some people up and some people down in terms of their compliance behavior. And so before I kind of show you those results, I just wanted to tell you kind of how we're thinking about that and how we're kind of reinterpreting the intervention. We think that participants experience the treatment as kind of a partisan pitch for expanding taxation, so a partisan pitch for a policy preference. So here's the mayor here. The mayor's a member of a political party, the APC, and she's also making pitches during the town hall that taxing is good. So the FCC is going to take your money, is going to deliver services to the people of Freetown. She's making a pitch for kind of fiscal exchange, this policy. And so there's reason to believe, especially in the political psychology literature, that partisan cues, so elite partisan cues can positively, or they can positively shape policy preferences for co-partisans. They can also generate backlash from partisans. Okay, and those are exactly the types of patterns that we see when we look at the kind of conditional effects based on partisanship. So here, this lighter blue line shows the treatment effect on compliance for people who are self-reported co-partisans of the mayor. We see a large 7.3 percentage point increase in tax compliance. That's about that's more than a quarter of the baseline level. But we see this countervailing effect of about negative 4 percentage points for people who said that they weren't co-partisans of the mayor. Okay, and as a kind of additional evidence that actually what's happening here is that the intervention is shaping people's preferences about policy, we see a very similar pattern for how they for their policy. So we ask people, do you think expanding taxation is good? Do you want to do that? Treated co-partisans move up. They're more likely to agree that they should expand taxation. Treated non-co-partisans move down. They're less likely to support taxation. Second thing we think is going on here is not only is people receiving the intervention as a partisan cue, they're also receiving it as an attempt to kind of influence their existing position on the policy of taxation. And so at baseline, about 57% of people said they supported expanding taxation. We think taxation is good if it leads to better services. But about 40% said we don't want to expand taxation. And again, in kind of the political psychology literature, there's good evidence that people work really hard to interpret new information in line with their existing beliefs. So there's a lot of work that shows when people receive these kind of persuasive arguments, people who already tend to agree with the argument move further towards that argument, and people who already tend to disagree can kind of polarize and backlash against it. And again, we see kind of similar patterns for tax compliance and tax analysis. So here, what I'm showing you is predicted marginal treatment effects based on your baseline attitude towards taxation. So people here are the people that said, I absolutely agree that we should expand taxation. Treatment effects for that group are positive. Other groups that were less convinced by the idea of expanding taxation, we see negative treatment effects. And again, those kind of countervailing forces come out in the wash. We see a similar pattern for the way that people's preferences about taxation move based on their baseline preferences. People who already supported taxation at baseline are more likely to support it. The opposite for people that didn't support taxation. So just to kind of summarize the way that we're interpreting this these patterns and cell effect, partisan affiliation and existing tax policy preferences shape the impact of this participatory budgeting program on people's preferences towards taxation, and in turn shapes their tax compliance behavior. I'm not going to talk about it, but we kind of rule out some kind of alternative explanation for these patterns. We don't think we don't see similar heterogeneous impacts on legitimacy outcomes. We don't see that these groups proxy for preferences about what types of services are delivered, or that they proxy for satisfaction with the services that are provided. So just to kind of summarize the findings and the contributions we think that we make on compliance, we see this, that the intervention does not have an average effect, but it has these kind of conditional effects. So the effect of voice on compliance is conditional on political factors. Now, on legitimacy, by contrast, we see this clear positive effect, and that's for all subgroups. Okay, so what do we make of that? Well, one thing that we think that our work nuances existing work on the effect of participation on compliance. So existing work is much more unconditional in its findings. So work from lab experiments, historical work on the development of fiscal capacity, observational research on participatory budgeting, all say this expanded voice should lead to higher compliance. We nuance that by saying, well, maybe for some subgroups, but actually in the context we study, that all comes out in the wash. Second, and this is mainly focused on the legitimacy effects, we show that this intervention, this participatory budgeting intervention, is a very successful strategy for boosting perceptions of government legitimacy. Okay? And while we don't see that legitimacy translates into immediate compliance effects in the short run, there are all sorts of reasons for imagining why that might matter for building fiscal capacity in the long run, and also for the government accomplishing other types of policies that it wants to accomplish. So for instance, a more legitimate government might find it easier to enforce taxation. Okay? It might find it easier to make other sorts of reform required to build fiscal capacity in the future. And our third contribution is just that the study is an example of the way that technology, and a very simple technology, can be used in public administration, e-governance. And so we showed that this very simple WhatsApp chat group can be a positive way for governments to engage citizens in public affairs. Okay, and we think that it's also highlights a potential positive avenue for WhatsApp to engage citizens, because WhatsApp often is seen as like a channel for misinformation. There's a lot of good studies about how politicians use WhatsApp for misinformation. We show how it can be positively used to engage citizens. So finally, just some kind of thoughts about policy implications. So should governments be using participatory budgeting? Well, the first thing we think comes out of our study is that if they do so, they need to think hard about the political context. So maybe in other situations where people are already more supportive of the government, this is going to lead to kind of straightforward positive effects on compliance. In our more polarized situation, we see more conditional impact. And so governments need to think about things like, is the intervention likely to prime partisanship? Is the policy reform, is the context of the intervention already a politicized one? Kind of second thing to consider is that when we think about generalizing the impacts of our study, there are two things to keep in mind. One is that we don't capture total effects of the intervention, in the sense that we don't capture how participatory budgeting affects people outside of the study. As I mentioned, we see some kind of suggestive evidence for positive spillover. And so the total effects of the intervention might be more positive than what I showed you here. And the second thing to keep in mind is that in an effort to rigorously evaluate this policy, we use a randomized approach. And so we randomized property owners into the study, and people had to opt out, basically. So compliance rate in our study is about 80%. In the real world, people opt in to participatory budgeting. And so maybe for the subsample that opts in, treatment effects are more likely to be larger. And as I mentioned, the kind of third thing for governments to think about is that legitimacy effects might be able to facilitate broader developments of fiscal capacity and administration more generally. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. That's a very provoking and stimulating presentation we had. So open for questions to Kevin. Please.
Have you thought about engaging citizens different ways, maybe not with the mayor, but other leaders in the community who run the schools, who run where they have benefited from the services, new services, and it would be less politicized?
Let's take
Okay,
a couple of others. Yeah.
Could you clarify, given how explicit the link was between property tax specifically and voice, so participatory budgeting? In the messages of the mayor, for example, I know she was mentioning tax, you said it on the slide, but how was this made completely explicit to the, because I was thinking maybe that to also explain this compliance effect.
So how explicit was the link between property taxation and service delivery?
Two more questions.
Is the time span not too short? If it is just a 1 year, maybe it can be seen as promotion or a stunt. Do people not want to see it, say, more years in a row, like at least 3 years or so, before drawing real conclusions?
Seeing the program itself, engaging participatory budgeting for multiple years.
Yeah.
Okay.
You mentioned somewhere that 80% of the people who opted out were the sample size that you had. Am I reading that right?
80% opted in.
Opted in.
So,
right.
so we invited people to participate, some one-sided non-compliance, but 80% who were invited participated.
So, was there any correlation between people who participated in participatory budgeting and the ones that were for the current regime in the government, and the ones that were against decided to opt out of participatory budgeting, and hence a relation of that to saying that compliance went up and compliance went down in both the groups?
I see, okay.
And a bonus last one, if I may, from my end. So your the explanatory narrative, right, is a political one, and you do a PhD in political science, obviously. But what about the administrative aspect? So increasing compliance also has to do with behavioral change on the one part, but also there are, in some cases, insurmountable administrative billing and collection issues with the property tax. Did you look into that as an additional explanatory avenue?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So let's pause here.
Okay, let me take the last ones first. So I think probably the administrative aspect that might have held up compliance the most is on the enforcement. And so the reform was really good at issuing bills. There was still no bump in enforcement measures taken with the program. And so I think maybe one of the interpretations here is that voice can create more positive feeling towards the government, and people will be happier with taxes being enforced, but still people don't pay taxes unless some people are being punished for not doing so. And so I think on the administrative side, you'd love to see more enforcement. But it's still at a basically negligible baseline. The second thing, just about the non-compliance. So I didn't mention too much about the estimation, but I could show you the effects when we consider the whole sample. We show you the intent to treat estimation, and it's the same. And so the results that I showed you are scaled a little bit to account for the non-compliance, but the ITT results are the same. The time frame question. I mean, so one thing that's interesting about this participatory budgeting program from the mayor is that she pitched this as a multi-year program. So she said, we're going to do $1,500 this year, and then next year we're going to do 20% of the budget. So a really, really big claim. So on the one hand, I think when we're thinking about the effects that we see here, people were told, credibly maybe by the mayor, that this was going to be a long-term process. Now, in reality, that hasn't taken place. And so you might think that would impact future compliance behavior, but the results that we're observing here are even in the context of the mayor promising this will be a long-term program. So I think it's very possible that these things evolve. We've been talking about this evolve over the long haul. In this case, the mayor promised that they would, even though it hasn't yet manifested.
I would expect it would get better.
The longer
Already
goes on.
after 1 year have some good indications, then if it continues, I think it will go.
I think that's the optimistic interpretation that we might also put on it. To say, you know, attitudes are moving first, and maybe behavior next.
But it didn't.
But exactly, all we can say here is it hasn't as far as we've looked at.
Stood, political stood.
Yeah, Kami, so in the link between property taxation and services is really done by the mayor in her videos. And so I wouldn't say it's an overall theme of the digital town halls. The digital town halls are about what are development challenges, sharing those development challenges with the mayor. The mayor took the opportunity in two of her videos to make this linkage very explicit. She said in her first video, hey, we're talking about $1,500 now, but this process is really important because as we start to bring in more tax revenue, property tax revenue, we're going to spend it on improved services. She said a very similar thing in her second video. And so it wasn't the overall theme of the town halls, but the link was explicit from the mayor. And then the first thing is other types of leaders, essentially, like you know, if these town halls were led by not politicians or promoted by non-political figures, definitely we've been thinking about how this might play out in a less politicized context. And so the last presentation mentioned that this had been extended to a second city where because it's aligned with the central government, it's less politicized. And so we might think that if the reform was done there and incorporated some kind of apolitical people, or rather the intervention was done there, it played out differently. And so that's something we've actively been thinking about, and we can explore doing it again with kind of apolitical figures.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And now we go to our third presentation from Nicholas. Should local and traditional authorities collaborate in raising property tax? And we see that in many of the countries that we work, like unregistered lands, customary lands, indigenous people, what's their role in the property tax agenda. So. All right, the floor is yours.
Okay, all right, good morning, everyone. So yeah, today I'll be talking about the first I'm doing a PhD, so this is one of the first papers I'm writing on the topic of property taxation, specifically trying to understand whether there is, in the Zambian context, whether there is interest for collaboration between traditional authorities and the local government in property taxation. And for those who are not familiar with the Zambian context, it is a bit more complicated. So that's hopefully this will also give you a little bit of that information as the complexities that are being faced in other African countries. So a little bit of background is that, as you know, revenue mobilization is central to state building, but it has been quite African countries have unfortunately underperformed. Their tax to GDP is twice as low, especially when compared to OECD countries. And so fiscal decentralization has been promoted as one of the ways to empower local governments, and property taxation being one of them. And so if we look at Zambia specifically, where Logri, with whom I work, has been doing some work there, Zambia's tax to GDP is low, and even more so when compared to other economies in the region. But specifically, if you look at the property tax to GDP revenue ratio, it is 10 times lower than OECD countries, and again, lower than you would expect for a country of that economy. But one of the reasons that may explain this is the existence of a dual land tenure system with traditional authorities and state lands. So and because of that, there are two different sets of tax obligation expected from citizens depending on where they live. People who live on state land are expected to pay property taxes, and people who live on traditional land are absolved of such obligations. And this is part of the Zambian law, the Rating Act. And because 50% of the land in Zambia falls under customary land, that is obviously creates a lot of problems. It creates a lot of problems in terms of fairness, and also it limits the ability of local governments in raising revenue and provide the services. And so that damages the social contracts and limits the ability for the country to develop properly. And so, yes, and so because of that, Zambia is looking to implement a very ambitious reform, and there are a lot of discussions that are being held at the highest levels of the government. And so the idea one of the ideas is to potentially expand property taxation to customary land. And so in addition to being more equitable and more fair, it also raise significantly more revenue. And obviously, so there is a lot of appeal to do that. But there are two things to be considered. The first one is chiefs, whether they'd be amenable to that. There's also a little bit of legality behind it, but well, we can always discuss it if needed. But the other part is also to think about whether there is willingness from the citizens to be taxed, not only on customary land, but also in informal settlements that are within council land boundaries. But because of encroaching spheres of influence from chiefs, people who actually live in council land, but informal settlements, believe that they are living under the leadership of traditional chiefs, and so therefore should also not be paying taxes. And so these are also people that need to be convinced in a way to join the program. And so one of the potential solution would be to actually collaborate with the chiefs in raising taxes. And so this is kind of the idea of, would there be interest from citizens for the chiefs to be involved in that process? And so this is one of the first question I'm asking, is whether there is broad interest. And the second one is to understand specifically what property tax features in the design would also convince people would increase or decrease support in property taxation. And this is quite relevant given that a lot of countries in Africa also have this dual land tenure system. So hopefully this will provide some contribution to the ongoing discussions. And so we're not going to spend too much time on this. It's been discussed already. Property tax creates a fiscal contract, a social contract. So it is something that's been promoted by a lot of experts. There is also that very clear link between taxation, accountability, reciprocity. And so it's been already very well studied. But one of the things that hasn't been studied very much is the fact that what is the impact of customary leaders in compliance and in willingness to pay taxes. And so Kevin actually, in his work in Sierra Leone, has already tackled this a little bit, where property owners being informed about the collaboration between traditional leaders and the local government in paying tax and in raising property taxes has actually led to increase tax compliance measures. So this is pretty positive. But the context in Sierra Leone is a bit different, where property taxation is allowed on customary land, and there's already a lot of informal agreements. And so this is quite different from the Zambian context. So this is hopefully the context differs quite a bit. The approach that I'll be using is the control experiment. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept, but I'll be going through it. But the idea is essentially to try to find a way to understand people's preferences when being offered different programs. So the idea of this research is to essentially understand what is the best property tax policy program to design to get the broadest buy-in. And it's been already used, especially in elections, to try and understand preferences of candidates. It's been used in marketing to try to understand preferences in terms of phone types, but it has barely been used in the field of taxation, and only once in the field of taxation in developing countries. So this again, hopefully, will provide evidence on a very nascent subfield. So the study took place in Zambia, like I said, in the Luapula province, which is the poorest province in Zambia. The conjoint experiment was embedded as part of a large property owner survey of 2,400 people. And so because of that, the control experiment itself also has a lot of data in terms of attitude toward taxation, property ownership, fairness of the inequitability of the system overall, property tax system, and just this tax overall. The data has only been completed, the data collection was only completed a couple of months ago. So a lot of the results that I'm presenting us at the initial stage is still a lot of digging. So hopefully your feedback obviously would be more than welcome. The study took place in 3 different councils in the Luapula province, Kawangwa, Mansa, and Sampia, that are the 3 of the biggest cities in the province. And the respondents were disaggregated by 4 different groups because we wanted to capture a lot of the heterogeneity. The first one being property tax compliant, the second property tax non-compliant. So both of them have some sort of already formal engagement with the councils. The third one, property owners living in informal settlements within council boundaries. And so there is some sense of expectation from the government to provide services because they're on their lands, but at the same time, there's also a higher allegiance for the traditional leaders. And because they're not registered, there's also maybe some reticence into complying or to registering because some by fear of being kicked out of their houses and also maybe not getting the services that they feel they need. And the fourth one being respondents living in custom. And so the conjoint experiment was designed in such a way that each respondent was presented with 2 hypothetical property tax programs. Each of them had the same 5 components, which is the tax level, the start of the service provision, who to pay the tax to, which would be either to the local council or to the chief, who would then share with the local council. The fourth one, the how to pay, and finally the different potential perks that that the program would offer to try to engage people into local governance. And so maybe to give a little bit more. Make it a bit more concrete. So these are 2 policies that will be presented to the respondents. So as you can see, they have varying different levels. Some of them have 3 levels: low, medium, and high tax amounts. Some of them 2 and 4. And so the first step would be to randomly, within the survey, choose one of the levels, and then after which, again, I'm just adding the labels to make it a bit concrete. And so you can see, for example, that the tax levels for these 2 policies are exactly the same, between 50 and 100 kwachas, which is between $2.5 to $5, so a pretty small amount. And the start of service provision could be either before, the service would need to be paid before I pay taxes, at the same time after. The tax would be paid either to the chief that we share with the council or to the council directly. You can either pay in person, someone would come to collect, you can pay using USSD, or you would be using a mobile app. These are some of the potential attributes for the reform. And the third one, the last one would be the special perks, which would be either the option of taking part in participatory budgeting. The second one, which is the second and third one, are less active forms of engagement. We can either complain about services that you haven't received, or the third one, vote for the services that you would like to see in your community. And then to ensure that there would be any ordering effects, these attributes are completely randomized in order. And then I asked 3 sets of questions. The first one, which of these policies do they prefer? The second one would be to rate each of these policies in terms of level of satisfaction, from completely satisfied to completely satisfied. And the third one would be to ask specifically for within each policy, which attribute do they like the most and like the least. And this would be replicated 2 more times, so a total of 6 different profiles would be presented to the 2,400 respondents. So we have a decent sample size of 1,400 policy ratings and comparisons. And so one of the things the first hypothesis I was looking at is mainly to look, because it is kind of an exploratory work, is understanding broadly whether there is an interest, what property features matter the most. And obviously I expected that the tax amount would matter the most, but also whether there is interest specifically to collaborate with the local authorities to collect taxes. And the second hypothesis and third, it's essentially talking about so I argue that preferences are driven by 2 things: the anticipated and the expected benefits. The anticipated benefits is kind of what you, did I say it wrong? Right. I think vice versa. So the expected benefits, I should switch these. The expected benefits is more rooted on what the government is already providing. So it's based on the service that the government has already delivered, and there's more certainty. It's based on past experience and knowledge that you have on the government's capacity. Whereas anticipated benefits is more related to the trust and the belief and maybe hope from the government to provide services. So the first one relates more to the status quo, whereas the second one relates more to maybe the hope and maybe trust that you may have with the government. So it also relates to the social contract. And so very briefly, I'm using the average marginal component effect, which is something which is very similar to the average, to the ATE anyways, in many ways. And I use the policy ratings itself as the outcome variable because it gives a lot more information. Choosing a policy, you may be choosing two policies that you're equally satisfied with both of them. So excluding the one you don't like is kind of going way off the data in some ways. And so this is maybe this is the first result. Just to looking overall at the broad the first hypothesis, basically try to understand which of the tax features matter the most. So here we have the base levels. So here's the low tax amount, medium and high tax amount. So it's pretty clear that obviously the higher the tax amount, the profits in the property tax reform, the less likely people would be to support property taxation, would even drop up to 12% for a higher tax amount. We also note that people would rather see the services come before they decide to pay taxes, which makes sense in a context where there's very low service provision. We do know that there's actually no difference between willingness to pay to the council or paying to the chief, and that is irrespective if we look at this at the council level, even at the subgroup level for respondents living in customary land or on state land. We do know as well that, and that's also an argument for participatory budgeting, that this is something that is more favored by respondents that rather actually understand a bit more about the process and have a greater say as where the money goes, as opposed to just passively voting and complaining about it. And so now looking at the expected benefits, and so this is just a disaggregated analysis looking at respondents who believe that the local council is a good service provider versus those who are not. And we can clearly see a massive shift pretty much across all levels. So here the line essentially indicates the average share of respondents who believe that who are satisfied with any programs, about 63%. And so you can see definitely that massive shift in that direction, which is, and we get the same shift as well, whether respondents believe that they receive a fair share of services given their main contributions. What we do notice as well, which is interesting, is that we don't see such a shift if we compare respondents who have more information about property taxation. The baseline being so low, I think only 5% respondents actually know that property taxation funds public services, but amongst them, there's actually very little shift, maybe because of that low sample size. But the other thing is, respondents who actually receive more services don't actually express a greater support for property taxation. The only difference you would see would be for a higher tax amount. So which kind of makes it is a kind of a sequentiality where I'm willing to pay more if I already see some services, but not before that, which kind of makes sense again, and it fits within the literature. And looking at anticipated benefits, so here we it again supports the literature that greater trust in the government and greater confidence in the government actually leads to more support in taxation. We do know that there is a greater the shift is greater when looking at confidence, and so there's a bit of an argument that maybe confidence and trust, whilst being related, actually are kind of different concepts. And we note that specifically when looking at trust and confidence in the chiefs and the headmen. We don't see any shift for trust in the chiefs and headmen, but we do see a little bit of a shift in terms of confidence. And again, trust is related to belief and and related to faith, whereas confidence relates more to actually believing that this person will be able to do the job. So there is a bit of a balance to strike into how much we need to invest in trust, but also how much we need to invest into confidence. We also see, so there's again a lot to look at, but there's a lot of things that don't move at all. So if we look at people who actually support the mayor or support the chief, there's again no shift in preferences. Whether there is also belief that whether you pay taxes already or whether you make contributions to the chief, there's absolutely no shift. So it seems like the way to bring people in the social function by paying taxes is not sufficient. So obviously a little bit more work that needs to be done. So yes, and so one thing looking at that, I'm trying to think about how to operationalize trust in itself. And so I looked through different lenses. The first one, the governance, whether increased accountability, transparency, and lower corruption indicators would actually lead to greater willingness to pay taxes. And we do see increased support specifically in terms of accountability. People want to know how where the money is going, what kind of services and what kind of programs the council is investing in. The finances, the nitty-gritty, they don't really care about it that much. And corruption and efficiency matters to a lesser extent as well. Then I look at the tax system itself, and fairness doesn't matter anywhere as close as the facilitation. That is how easy it is to actually pay taxes, how easy it is to understand what taxes you're supposed to pay. Maybe it is very contextual because we're in a situation with very low tax compliance in Zambia, especially in that area. I think it's close to maybe 4-5% of people actually pay taxes, property taxes. And in terms of tax morale, it's interesting to see that people who believe that self-help is more efficient than actually paying taxes are more likely to support taxes. And so I have to dig a little bit into that. I know that there's about 20% of respondents in customary land who make contributions to the chief, so it's not that much. I don't know if that could. Yeah, I literally have no idea. I just have to still look into it a little bit. But yeah, so the next steps is obviously trying to dig a little bit more into the process and the mechanisms behind it. There's also, like I mentioned before, that we also asked about which attributes people like the most and like the least. And it is interesting to see, I didn't do the analysis yet, but it's interesting to see that the first three things that hit the most, obviously the tax amount, but the fourth one, it is to pay the chief. So there's clearly a reticence to pay to chiefs, despite the chiefs being the more trusted authority, the one that acts on concerns, either the more responsive, and so it is interesting that whilst the council is clearly seen as a service provider, the fact that they don't want to have any involvement from the chiefs is something that we probably want to dig a little bit deeper, because without the chiefs, we can't actually implement property taxation on customary land. So how do we kind of strike that balance where we want them involved while at the same time knowing that the citizens are maybe a little reluctant to have them involved? Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you very much. Any questions for Nicholas?
Yeah, I'll ask one.
Please.
It's a general question, and maybe you can answer it. I know taxing land on customary land is extremely difficult because in my view, property tax is a utility tax. So it comes with benefits to the citizens and rights, and it's generally they pay because they see an increase in the capital value of their properties and whatever's in this around. So generally it is a utility tax in most of the developed countries, for example. And I think my experience being I come from South Africa, so we have these large municipalities with both rural and we have wall-to-wall municipalities, so they're rural and urban in nature there. And generally, it is very difficult to tax the traditional authority land. It is impossible, firstly because they don't have title. Secondly, the cost of tax collection doesn't warrant the raising of the tax. You're going to collect $2, but it's costing you $5 to raise the tax. So what's the So I wanted to know if any other countries that you have experience in working on is also thinking about customary land tax, because I haven't seen it working in any other country.
Any other questions?
And just maybe a clarification or a desire for an explanation. I mean, you finished with this comment that chiefs are more trusted, and we see that in Zambia, but also kind of across the continent. But yet, people don't prefer to pay to them. So, what's your explanation of that? Do you have like any kind of intuition about why that might be the case? Do you see that as kind of contradictory?
I'm just very clear.
Yeah.
Also on the last topic, do you think one potential explanation could be that the way the item was phrased could lead to a social derivative bias, so people are not willing to admit that they don't trust actually their chiefs? Or is it something you can exclude because of reason?
And the last one, yes.
Sorry, oh, I was actually just going to contribute and say that could it also be a confidence thing? So they trust their chiefs, but they're not confident they can deliver services.
Mhm.
And so, how do you differentiate what's actually going on in their minds? Because I can sort of see them not believing that the chiefs can actually deliver services because the infrastructure to do so isn't there. So,
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. So in terms of, I guess overall about the question related to the chiefs. So we asked respondents who they believe should be providing any of the services that we have in the list, and they essentially all expect services to be provided by the council, the central government. And even looking at the number of respondents who actually make contributions, only 20% of them actually contribute in any way in either labor or in cash in the local developments. So and the other question that we also asked is what the respondents talk to when they actually talk to the chiefs or to the headmen, and it mainly has to do with personal matters. But when they need to talk about services, they reach out to the MPs, to the local council. So there is clearly that distinction of, okay, we trust the chief, it's the moral authority, but the one who will be providing the service are clearly going to be the states. And so that may explain why there is a preference to, but at the same time, what puzzles me a little bit, and maybe I'm completely wrong, is that I would imagine that an authority that is more trustworthy, that acts in the concern more than the council, even though they may, because there's a way it was phrased was, you could either pay you could pay to local council, or you could pay to the chief, who would share with council. Obviously, the sharing is because this is kind of the way that we'd envision a potential collaboration. Why would the chief just collect and get nothing back? So it's a way to kind of involve them. The share, I guess, maybe it is to interpretation. They could imagine only 10% goes to council, 90% of it. So maybe that is why there may be that concern. But obviously, we didn't want to put a numeric amount because then we'd have to control and vary with that. So yeah.
I mean, just like two ideas to think about. Like one is people might just view that process as inefficient. Well, I know council doesn't deliver the services. Is it not inefficient and then for leakages to give it to the chief to pass on to the council? But so that's like one potential explanation for why they don't want to give it to the chiefs. The second thing could be, well, if the chiefs are responsible for collecting the tax, people think that they'll be better at enforcing it. Given that people don't want to pay, they don't want to put the authority in charge that can actually enforce it. So let the government collect. We all know that the government can't collect.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's my vote for the policy. I don't know, there's a couple of different explanations.
Yeah, so that's actually a good idea. I mean, one thing that I was looking at is, if you look at willingness to pay is much higher actually among respondents to customary land, and second by respondents who don't comply because they apparently get away with it, and still, and the reticence is higher amongst people who are compliant and people who are in informal settlements, because they're kind of in a hybrid system where they expect services and they are on land, but they're not getting anything at all. So it's I see why, but at the same time there is such a difference in service provision between state land and customary land, that even the chiefs themselves. So we took part in the House of Chiefs assembly last year, and officially everyone rejected the idea of property taxation, but then once the record was set, okay, we hit the idea, they came to talk to us and said, okay, this is actually a great idea. We're noticing that we need to raise money, we need to provide services. We're actually concerned about our legitimacy, and we're concerned that people actually will start moving out of customary land. So it's there is definitely that desire for services. So I don't know whether they would want to have, if they're interested in an institution that it will not enforce and not raise any revenue, when there is such a drive and desire to actually get revenue. And state is actually perceived as being a good service provider, especially in customary land as opposed to in other areas where there hasn't been that that interaction yet and that engagement. So I mean, this is definitely a potential thing to think about, but yeah, this seems a bit more complicated.
All right. Do you have other questions that you didn't respond to? Couple of minutes. Yes.
Just one quick one. I think, yeah, other than this Sierra Leone context, and Kevin can speak to it way more than I can. I know there's been also discussion, I think, in Cameroon as well about the issue, quote unquote, of customary land, property taxation customary land. And I guess there are also variants to it in Pakistan as well. Someone talked to me about it as well, about not customary land, but traditional authorities having such an influence that also impedes the ability to raise property tax as well. So there are some examples, but there's not much on it, at least, yeah, there's still a lot to learn from it.
Good.
Just one question. Next time, if you're trying to do something, maybe if you could possibly add a dimension of gender and ability to pay taxes, because we find that female-headed homes pay taxes. So I know it's not what you've done so far, but maybe in a future study, maybe look at the gender issues.
So we actually have a gender element specifically in that survey that we still need to look at. But yeah, we do notice that heads of household and women are more likely to support any forms of property taxation. And we have a lot of other data that we want to look at, like the risk preference, their roles within the household. So we have that as well. We still need to write a PAP before we can actually start digging into that part.
Great, thank you very much, Nicholas. And over to you, Namita, empowering Indian cities to drive climate action by expanding fiscal space for property tax.
Hi everyone, I'm Namita. I'm here from this organization called Janagraha, that is a civil society systems change organization in India. I work this presentation here, this topic on empowering Indian cities to drive climate action, expanding fiscal space through property tax reforms, is not really based on a single research paper. It's actually a synthesis of the work that we have done over the course of the last 6 years on property tax reforms across India. Some of this work we have done with the World Bank, so I'm really grateful for the opportunity. Rajul is here, who I work extensively with in India, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to present a synthesis of this work. This is a study of about 28 states, so total of 28 states in India, 28 state municipal acts, property taxation in 28 states, allied rules. It is also, I've done deep policy engagement work and field visits across upwards of 100 urban local governments in 8 states within India, as well as worked deeply with the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, which is the central nodal agency for urban related issues in India. So this is a synthesis of that work, and over the course of this presentation, what I'll try to make a case for is saying that property tax in India is quite low. It has shown tremendous strides in the last 5 years. Property tax collections have increased tremendously, but we are very, very far away from calling our cities financially self-sustainable. And we are very far away from creating the fiscal space to actually engender local climate action. And through this, I'll also show some case studies of some important states that have actually done good work in improving property tax that could present opportunities for cross-national learning. So we all know that cities are critical for climate action, more so in India because we are much more urbanized than we admit. So the statutory definition of urbanization fits us at about 30% urban and 70% rural. But if you take international definitions and you take many more other definitions, we are anywhere between, we are much above 40 to 50% urban within India. And cities are critical for climate action. They provide services in 5 of the most critical climate-related services in sectors that are important for climate. So you have water supply, sanitation, urban transport, disaster management, and solid waste management. Some estimates say that about $3.6 trillion are required for Indian cities up till 2050 for them to actually take action in climate mitigation and adaptation. The truth is that cities in India actually don't have that kind of money. They don't have those kinds of funds. They are not even empowered enough to actually raise those kinds of funds. And we are very highly reliant on national and state budgetary resources for undertaking any kind of initiative. And it's thus very critical, and especially COVID was a wake-up call for India, that it's very critical for cities to now start raising own sources of revenues. So own sources of revenues, your taxation, user charges, rental income, etc., are poor and insufficient in cities, and these cities are unable to meet their expenditure needs. So on an average, 49% of the total revenue of cities is generated through own sources. Of this 49%, 74% on an average in cities is entirely spent on paying salaries of government authorities. So there's a very small pie available, very small share available for any kind of O&M expenditure outside of salaries, let alone capital expenditure. So property tax forms the largest source within those own source revenues on an average across the board. So it becomes the most critical source of revenue for cities, and that's where I'm going to focus on. So property tax in India has traditionally been low. It lags behind OECD nations. So if you see here, Japan stands at 1.9% of property tax to GDP ratio. OECD average is at 1.02%. And even in nations like Colombia and Mexico, it's 0.8% and 0.2% respectively. But India stands at 0.15% of GDP. Property tax revenue can provide the leverage that cities need. Enhancing these revenues can provide leverage to cities in climate-related spending, but how do you do it? So we all know that property tax revenue, there are three levers that can enable property tax revenues to increase. You have coverage, that is number of properties that get included in the tax net. You have tax base, which is assessment of the properties that are included in the tax net. And you have collection efficiency, which is how many of these properties you actually end up collecting from as opposed to how many you build. Now, these two levers, coverage and collection efficiency, are what the cities largely have the power to change. They can bring in more properties into their tax net. They can improve collection efficiency through administrative reforms. But tax base, on the other hand, has traditionally stayed with states. Cities don't have the power to define their tax bases, define their valuation methodology, or define when to increase tax rates, how much to increase tax rates by. Cross-cutting all of these three levers is the empowerment that local governments have, the devolution of that power to the local governments to actually tax properties, and also the incentive environment that states and central governments create to align their local governments' incentives to actually increase property tax revenues. This is of important focus for me because a lot of the power comes from the center and the state governments, so they can drive a lot of the reforms. And this is what we are going to talk about in the subsequent slides. Just before I enter into that, just to give you context, we are a federal structure, so you have a central government. Underneath the central government, you have 28 state governments. Below that, you have local governments, so you have urban local bodies as well as panchayati raj institutions, which are rural local bodies. So you have three tiers of the government. The third tier was formed in mid-90s through an amendment to the constitution, and performance of that amendment has been weak. So if you look at the devolution of actual power, functions have been largely devolved to the cities, but commensurate funds and functionaries have not been. In the context of property tax, while cities are allowed to levy property tax, they are not allowed to set the tax base, valuation, exemption methodology, etc., etc. Now, property tax, as I was mentioning in the beginning, has shown a tremendous increase. Estimations pegged property tax at $3 billion in FY 17-18. Today, it is 1.5 times that. 22-23 pegs it at about $4.5 billion. So there has been a tremendous jump in property tax collections, and this has largely been driven by the two levers, the administrative levers of improving collection efficiency and coverage. So collection has gone up by a CAGR of 9%, demand has gone up by a CAGR of 6%. This entire administrative reform has happened because it was incentivized by the central government. So incentives, top-down incentives actually pushed the local governments to create reforms, to do reforms in the administration of taxation, which led to this increase. So talking about the role of central government, property tax growth largely driven by central government initiatives. There have been 4 very large schemes driven by the central government in the last 5 years. The total outlay of these schemes have been $68 billion and huge sum of money for local governments in India. And this, even to draw a single rupee of this grant money from the central government, the government of India said, you have to reform your property tax. And that's what led to change. So even to draw one single rupee of 68 billion, there were reforms that were attached to either you increase your property tax commensurate to the state GSTP, or you say link your property tax valuation to market values and we'll give you some money if you do that. So it is because of this initiative that local governments have started pulling their weight and have started taking more administrative reforms. Some notable best practices which I feel can have cross-national learning opportunities, especially for the Global South. There are 3 types of case studies that I'll cover. The first type of case study is about databases not speaking to each other, because of which there are a lot of unidentified properties and there's a lower tax base. So there are 4 major departments within India that maintain property records. At the local level, you have the Property Tax Department, you have the Building Plan Permission Department. At the state as well as district levels, you have the Stamp Duty and Registration Department as well as the Electricity Department. Now, Stamp Duty and Registration Department is an interesting one because at the state level, you have a different type of taxation on property, which is entirely different from your annual property taxation. So if you are owning a property in a city, you would be paying an annual tax on that. And that tax will go to the city, to the local government. But if I have to sell my property to somebody, I have to pay an additional charge, which is much higher than the annual rate of property tax. It's to the tune of about 3 to 4% of the actual transaction value. It actually makes a whole lot of difference in the property market. And that transaction value charge is what is charged by the districts and in some cases by agglomerations, etc. And that is called Stamp Duty and Registration Charge. So this is a different department outside of local authorities, outside of local government that maintains property registers. And you have the Electricity Department that's provided either at the state level or at the district level by different boards. It could be private, it could be semi-private, etc. So all of these departments are maintaining property records. None of them are speaking to each other. So Property Tax Department would have different registers. Each of the other departments would have different registers. And because of this, you have a lot of properties that go unassessed. You have a lot of properties that are underassessed. There are 2 states that have taken the initiative of actually integrating some of these databases. The first one is Assam that I'm talking about. It's on the northeastern side in the country. It's a relatively smaller state. They have actually integrated their property tax database to electricity records. And because of this, within a year, they were able to bring about 400,000 more properties into the tax net. There is also a state down south, Telangana, which has integrated its property records to Stamp Duty and Registration as well as Building Plan Permission. Because of this integration, the records got cleaned up. So any mismatches in ownership got cleaned up. You had a lot of new properties getting into the tax net. You had a lot of underassessed properties being revised and assessments being revised. And it actually led to auto-fetching of market values. It led to auto-mutation of properties across departments. And it also led to auto-assessment of property tax. So this has led to a tremendous increase in property tax collections in Telangana. The second type of case studies that we have seen is how do you circumvent the issue of staff inefficiencies and staff capacities. So just to give you a sense, in India, you have very weak human capital working in city and local governments. So if you look at the medium cities, and I'm calling them medium cities, even though their populations are upwards of 500,000, you have larger cities which have 1 to 5 million population, and you have mega cities which are greater than 5 million population. Across these cities, the level of vacancy in sanctioned positions is again more than 40%. So it doesn't matter what size your city is, you have a vacancy of more than 40% in your staff. So if you are required a tax team of 100 people, 40 of those people do not exist in your team. So you have a very low staff capacity, and a lot of this work is manual, which makes it impossible to actually reach all the properties and actually make this tax collection more efficient. So how do you circumvent this? Because the problem is cities don't have the money to pay for the salaries. So 54% of the cities do not generate enough revenues to actually pay the salaries of the sanction posts. And mind you, these sanction posts are not based on any scientific calculation. These are sanctioned some 40 years back, they haven't been revised yet. So there could be positions that are still needed beyond these sanctioned positions, and I'm not even counting those. So 54% of the cities can't pay salaries. There is a very slow process of recruitment because local governments have to keep taking permissions from the state government to recruit even a single sanctioned position. And you have limited availability of personnel which have adequate skills. You have very bad programs for performance management, or negligible or inexistent programs for performance management, or for upskilling of your existing staff. So how do you circumvent this? So the state, Odisha, came up with a very unique solution. What they did was they had a 38% vacancy rate. Existing staff was involved in many more activities, ad hoc responsibilities outside of property tax collection. What they did was they integrated their bills. So a single household would get the same bill for property tax, for water, and they created something called one household, one collector. And at the same time, they contracted something called self-help groups. So there were female self-help groups that had been mobilized. They basically contracted collection out to them. And these female self-help groups then went out, they earned a small commission on every rupee that they collected. And this led to a 50% increase in a single year for tax collection to go up. And it also led to better efficiencies in terms of better billing and better collection. The third case study that I have is data-based decision-making and driving policies through data. Before 2020, there was no single place or no website or no digital medium by which you could actually get data on city revenues or expenditure. You had no idea how much your city was earning, you had no idea how much they were spending. Post 2020, on the back of the leadership that the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs showed, and back of mandate of the largest 15th Finance Commission grant, which is the largest grant for local bodies in India, City Finance was created. World Bank also supported this. It is now the single source of truth for any kind of city level data. It has 4,200 cities out of 4,700, 4,200 cities data on annual financial statements or income and expenditure statement. It is able to give you digitized, standardized, credible, and comparable data. So you could compare cities across the states, you could compare your city within the state. And this, it also has something called different dashboards. So it has national performance dashboard, own revenue dashboard, which has a separate dashboard for property tax. We also have service level benchmark performance dashboard. So this was able to actually center the conversation of property tax in India. So because of data, now suddenly everybody could say, hey, this is a problem that needs to be addressed. And a lot of this data actually went into defining policies at the central government level, which then led to administrative reforms at the local level. As I said, this picture is great when seen, but when you see in aggregation, it's a very, very long way to go if we want to call our cities financially sustainable. Property tax demand, as you can see, even though it has consistently increased, as a percentage of GDP, has actually gone down. Collection at the same time has increased, but it has stayed almost at level when in the last 2 years when compared to the GDP growth. So despite having a GDP growth of 11% CAGR, property tax has not increased. And this is a very untapped potential that cities have that they can tap into to actually create fiscal space. Just to give you a sense of how bad and how low the tax base in India is, if you look at the left-hand side here, here I've given market values of properties in some of the international cities. So the red ones are international cities and green ones are the mega cities in India. So you have Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, and Hyderabad, which are again upwards of 5 million population. big metropolitan cities in India. I've compared them to New York, Singapore, Vancouver, Johannesburg, Quezon City in Philippines. If you see the market value of the properties, they are almost comparable. Of course, let's keep aside New York and Singapore, but they're almost comparable to the largest cities internationally. However, if you look at the share of property tax to market value, the picture is quite abysmal. So you have Indian cities lagging behind almost all the cities in terms of property tax to market value ratio. And that just shows us that the real growth that can be unlocked has to come from improving tax base. It has to come from the largest million-plus cities, and these cities need to take the leadership of actually start taxing more of the market value and making the tax more progressive. And these cities are also important for climate action because these are, as I said, largest cities, not just nationally, but internationally. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Namita. That was a great overview of a fascinating topic in India. Any questions? We have, issues of policy, of tax administration, of valuations you mentioned. Any questions for Namita?
I was curious about the slide you had about the central incentives to incentivize greater focus on property taxation. It's mostly just a clarifying question, so that was an interesting topic. So you wrote there $67 billion were allocated to undertaking mandatory property tax reforms.
Yeah.
So I'm interested, does that mean that the $67 billion were for doing the reforms, or it was just if you do the reforms, you'll get this money to use for whatever you want?
It is if you do this reform. This was not the only reform, but one of the reforms. If you do this reform, it is a mandatory condition for you to be even eligible to get a share of the $68 billion.
Okay. And were there, how big I don't need all the details, but was it one of 20 different things people had to do to be eligible, or was it a relatively small group?
So I'll take one example. So 15th Finance Commission was actually the first scheme to have come up with this. The 15th Finance Commission is nothing but this is an independent body that decides the formula by which federal taxes get allocated to local governments and state governments. So they decided that if you are to increase two mandatory conditions, start publishing your audited financial statements on city finance. Second condition was if you increase your property taxes commensurate to your state GSTP, you are eligible. So two conditions. If you do this, you're eligible for the grant money.
Great. Thank you very much for the interest.
Yeah, same on that question. I think in some countries, especially in African countries, you can see that usually the central government rather disincentivize local governments to build their fiscal autonomy, right? For many reasons. And in this case, it's rather the opposite, where the central government is really pushing local governments to increase that fiscal autonomy. What was the reason for that push?
So the reason is there's a state government in between. Okay. So state government has more to lose if city governments become politically more empowered, because a mayor could be in direct competition to a chief minister, the head of the state in India. So which is why typically state governments have actually not devolved a lot of the power to local governments. That's the crux of the problem. Central government, on the other hand, has incentives to improve local government revenues, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of ground being poured into local governments. COVID was, as I said, a huge wake-up call because cities were not prepared for it. Cities absolutely had no resources to deal with it. State governments went to the central government to get resources. City governments did not have anybody to go to. It was a mess. So basically, central government has a lot of incentive to drive local governments to improve revenues. State government in between does try to ensure that the power does not get wrestled from them, but at the same time, everybody is realizing across the board that till you do not get city governments to be empowered enough to, maybe not empowered enough to decide what policies, but at least have enough money so that they don't keep asking for money from the state coffers.
Great. I think it may be time to wrap up with a very brief overview of the session. We started with a great presentation from Wilson and Colette on a very real policy and implementation issue. Is it Cadaster-First or is it property tax first? I presented 3 interesting cases where we had property tax first, where we had Cadaster-First with all its limitations, and hybrid cases from West Africa. Really the takeaway, at least for me, was that it depends really on the political economy and obviously the interest of the stakeholders, but still pending questions around the lit capture, the universality of either approaches, and a lot of food for thought. Then we moved to Kevin's presentation, looking into the fiscal side of the social contract and how participatory budgeting increases legitimacy or increased legitimacy in Freetown. And then also how it doesn't really trickle down to property tax compliance, and exploring some of the reasons why that might be the case. Then a very interesting and novel area of engagement, which is property tax in the context of customary lands, with Nicolas's presentation. There was a normative questioning in the title of your presentation, but also very good empirical evidence from your research in Zambia, and an interesting discussion around these issues. And we ended with Namita's presentation about India looking at the different sides of the equation, looking at tax policy, at expanding the tax base. You mentioned issues of valuation and the importance of integration and the ease of billing and collection, integrating tax base with other systems. So this has been a fantastic session. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and thanks again.